All right, let's get right into this explainer. We're looking at Alexander the Great, the rise and fall of an empire. This is a guy who's been, immortalized, intensely debated, and picked apart for over 2 millennia. And for good reason. I mean, just think about it for a second. How exactly did a 20-year-old kid forge the absolute largest empire in history in just 10 years? 10 years, going from a tiny Greek kingdom all the way to the edges of India. Mathematically, it almost sounds made up, right? Especially for someone barely out of his teens. But as we'll see, he didn't do it alone, and he definitely didn't start from scratch.
Part 1. The Ultimate Military Machine.
So before Alexander could conquer the known world, his dad, King Philip II, had basically transformed Macedonia from a mountainous backwater into this absolute powerhouse. Alexander inherited his father's master plan, but more importantly, he inherited a perfectly tuned 40,000-strong fighting machine. It was essentially an ecosystem of destruction. You had the phalangites forming an immovable center, the elite Hypaspes guarding their flanks, and then the shock troops, the companion cavalry. And Alexander, well, he personally led that elite cavalry unit. And their secret weapon? It was this massive 18-foot pike called the sarissa. Just picture this. You're facing a packed formation, 16 ranks deep. The spears of the first 5 rows are literally jutting out past the front line. Traditional Greek hoplites, with their standard 8-foot spears, couldn't even get close to the Macedonians without getting skewered. It was just a terrifying walking wall of iron. Section 2. Conquering the Persian Empire. Right, so in 334 BC, Alexander takes his army across the Hellespont and immediately slams into the Persian defense at the river Granicus. And his strategy here? It basically relied on completely reckless, fearless leadership. A leadership style that honestly almost got him killed on day 1. The accounts from this clash are wild. A Persian noble literally shattered Alexander's helmet with an axe, and right as another guy raised his sword to finish the job, Alexander's commander, Clitus the Black, swooped in and hacked off the attacker's arm, sword and all. Talk about a razor-thin margin between becoming history's greatest conqueror and dying in your very first battle. Fast forward just 18 months, and Alexander gets trapped on a narrow coastal plain at Issus. The numbers here are they're absurd. We're talking his 40,000 men steering down a Persian army of around 100,000. But the geography completely saved him. Being squeezed into a space just 6 miles wide meant King Darius couldn't actually use that massive numerical advantage. Alexander brilliantly used the terrain as a funnel, basically turning the sheer size of the Persian army from their greatest strength into a chaotic, crowded liability. Now, at the climactic Battle of Gaugamela, he's back on flat, open ground against maybe 80,000 Persians. Suddenly, Alexander leads his cavalry way out to the right. The Persians are watching this thinking, wait, could he really be trying to encircle our huge army? So they mirror his movement, stretching their own lines to block him. But actually, it was a total trap. By baiting the Persians out wide, Alexander forced them to stretch and weaken their center. The second that fatal gap opened up, he wheeled his cavalry around and charged straight through it, aiming right for King Darius. You can imagine the psychological shock of seeing this unstoppable force barreling straight at you. Darius panicked, abandoned his army, and sparked a massive rout. Game over. Which brings us to part 3. The king unravels. So, the Persian capital is burned, Darius is dead by a usurper's hand, and Alexander just keeps pushing east. But trying to run this incredibly massive, culturally divided empire while fighting brutal guerrilla wars, it took a serious psychological toll. He started descending into this dark paranoia. He executed his veteran general Parmenion and his son Philotas after a tortured confession about an assassination plot. And worst of all, in a drunken rage, he actually murdered Clitus the Black. Yeah, the exact same guy who saved his life back at Granicus. His oldest comrades were realizing their fearless leader was becoming dangerously volatile. To make things even more tense, he starts demanding praskinis. That's the traditional Persian ritual, where you essentially prostrate yourself, bowing down to the ground before the king. For his Greek troops, this was absolute blasphemy. To them, you only bowed like that for a god. They felt like they were watching their Macedonian king morph into an Eastern deity who demanded total submission. Look at this timeline. 8 straight years of agonizing, non-stop warfare from Granicus in 334 BC all the way across thousands of miles. It pushed his men beyond their breaking point. They marched through deserts, scaled mountains, took fortresses, all while watching the man they followed turn into someone they barely recognized. Part 4, the edge and the end. Eventually, they hit a boundary. And it wasn't drawn by an enemy, it was drawn by his own exhausted soldiers at the River Beas in 326 BC. After surviving a horrific battle against literal war elephants in India, the undefeated Macedonian army mutinied. Hearing rumors of even larger Indian armies waiting just over the horizon, they just refused to take another step. I mean, they hadn't seen home in a decade. They were undefeated, sure, but completely broken physically and spiritually. Alexander was furious, but for the very first time, he had to turn back. And getting back to Persia? An absolute three-part nightmare. First, a grueling 10-month slog down the rivers of the Punjab. Second, a ridiculously bloody siege where Alexander takes a terrible chest wound and nearly dies. And finally, a disastrous land march right through the Gedrosian Desert. The extreme heat and starvation were unimaginable, causing massive casualties. Just a punishing, brutal end to their eastward expansion. Finally, our last section, a fractured global legacy. Back in Babylon, grieving the sudden loss of his closest friend Hephaestion, Alexander himself catches a fever and dies. He was just 32 years old, never defeated in battle. He left no clear successor, meaning his massive empire immediately fractured into these bloody civil wars between his generals. But, and here's the massive takeaway for us today, while the political empire died, the cultural impact was permanent. This triggered the Hellenistic Age. The fusion of Greek ideas with local traditions in places as far as Afghanistan and Pakistan sparked revolutions in art, science, and government that literally laid the foundation for the world we live in today. He forged a massive empire through just unmatched strategic genius, but he paid for it in oceans of blood, massacres, and the betrayal of his closest friends. So what do you think? Was Alexander history's greatest hero, its most successful tyrant, or maybe both? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history you think you know.